So tonight, episode 15, the climax of classical antiquity. After this, we go into Christianity. And with the end of the Greek and Roman world, there is a sharp drop from what I call the heights of nobility and excellence and all the concerns of humanism, and a sharp break with what came before. And so I think it's appropriate that we're making that break at the halfway point, because everything kind of leads up to this, and then everything kind of leads from it. We're going to talk tonight about three Stoic philosophers: Musonius Rufus, who's actually a minor philosopher but makes a majorly interesting point about women and their equality. Then we're going to talk about Epictetus, who's the father of the self-help movement. And then finally, we're going to talk about Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, which is one of my single favorite books from antiquity, and a book that I think really could be helpful to everyone to live a happy life. Let's just get started. I'd like to ask you guys why you think Musonius Rufus, why he thinks women should study philosophy. I thought it was interesting where Musonius says, why would we wish for a foolish woman any more than for a foolish man? Women should be excellent just like men. All the attributes of a good woman would be improved by philosophy. So wisdom becomes everyone. I just would point out that this is a very early instantiation of what we now call feminism, which is that women should have the same rights and receive the same education as men. Moving on, let's talk about Epictetus. And I thought that Epictetus made the very interesting point about what lies within your control and what lies without your control, and how he believes that only our opinions about things can upset us and not things themselves. Do you wish peace and contentment? Release your attachment to all things outside your control. On that path lies freedom and happiness. Whatever lies beyond your control, let it go. Now let's just stop and think about that and talk about that a little bit. What do you guys think about that? Do you think that's true? Do you see the wisdom in that? Do you see the kind of genius of that? Because what's the point? You're like, oh my God, it's going to rain. Like there's literally nothing you could do about that. So does that seem like a good place to put your energy and your stress and all that kind of stuff? Or think about things you can control, like how much time am I going to spend studying biology versus history versus English? That you can control. What are you going to do? Are you going to scroll on your phone for 10 more minutes or 2 more hours? That you can control. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And we all spend a lot of time worrying about outcomes, but a lot of those outcomes are outside our control. And so I think he would say that's a real good way to make yourself unhappy, Epictetus would say. And he says then after that, instead of wishing to become a general, a congressman, or a celebrity, desire to become free. To become free, simply let go of whatever you cannot control. So Epictetus' message is really simple, and he repeats it, and he repeats it, and he repeats it, and he kind of unfolds it in all these different ways until you finally kind of see how, wow, it really has wide application. And then he talks about young women. And he says, some young women confuse their self-worth with their ability to attract the attention of men. They pour their energies into makeup, clothing, and jewelry. If they only realize that true beauty comes from virtue, honor, and self-respect. And again, we're seeing here at the end of classical antiquity a more enlightened view of women, which is saying that women are not just objects and play toys and to be dressed up like dolls and just to look good, but there's something more to them. Their character is important. They're fully human. They're not just objects and people who raise your children. And then he has this very interesting idea of what's wicked or wrong or evil. And he doesn't really think that evil has any identity or substance in and of itself. He just sees it as a missing of the mark. And I think that's a very healthy way to look at sin or wickedness. Is just like an error. It's like a falling short of the goal, right? So you didn't hit the target. You weren't fully excellent. The passage I'm thinking about, he says, the good stands before us like an archer's target. Evil does not exist in itself, but merely as a missing of the mark, like an errant arrow. Judge only your own thoughts, desires, and judge them only as a hitting of the bullseye or as a going astray. I thought that was pretty cool. And then in the next paragraph, he asks us to do something that's very difficult and challenging, but which I think he makes a good point about. And it reminds me of what Heraclitus said way back in the first week. Heraclitus, in one of his epigrams, said, there's a law that's common to all of us, but everyone makes exceptions for himself. Here he says, Epictetus, when a boy breaks our neighbor's vase, we likely say, oh, well, accidents happen. But how would you react if someone broke your own vase? You ought to react in the same way you did when someone damaged your neighbor's property. Now apply this to greater things. In other words, try to be objective and try to realize for whatever loss you have, someone else could have a similar loss and has had a similar loss. And when you think about that, it doesn't bother you as much. So in other words, try to make everything less personal and realize how it happens from the perspective of the universe. And then he says, finally, be careful where you place your values and be careful what you get invested in, because then you can't really react objectively. And here's a line which I would call your attention to. Where your attention and affection lie, there too your worship. Take care where you direct your focus and desires. So whatever becomes your values, that's going to start absorbing all your energy, right? So if it's your children or your spouse or your family, that's going to take it all. And, that's pretty healthy and normal. But let's say it's something else. You get really into playing a musical instrument. That's going to suck your time and effort. So just be careful what you make important in your life. And when we start reading the Bible on Monday, the Christian Bible, we're going to see that Jesus says very much the same thing. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. Same idea, exact same idea. So I'm pointing you now toward Christianity because so many of the ideas we find in Roman Stoicism, we also find in Roman Christianity. So this thing about the price of popularity, I thought it was very interesting because it applies beyond popularity. It could apply to being a top singer or a top softball player or anything else. I guess the idea is if you didn't maybe get the result that you hoped for, maybe it's because you weren't willing to pay the price. Maybe you weren't willing to pay the price in terms of the time, in terms of the effort, in terms of all the sacrifices. And so he says, do you envy someone popular at work, invited to parties and spoken of in social circles? Don't expect to equal anyone in effect without putting in the same effort. A person who rarely leaves home and who doesn't praise and encourage others will not attract friends. Everything has its price. So if someone has not invited you to a party, you haven't paid the price of the invitation. It would have cost you social engagement, conversation, encouragement, and praise. If you didn't want to pay the price, don't fret when you don't receive an invitation. Do you have anything good in place of the invitation? Yes. You have the pleasure of not making small talk with people you don't really like. So I thought that was pretty interesting, and it's a handy thing to keep in mind because it's very easy for us all to kind of feel like, a little bit of envy or a little bit of ennui or melancholy about not doing everything in life that we could possibly do. But it's true. You can pretty much do anything as long as you're willing to pay the price. And if you're not doing it, it's probably because, the price is too much for you in time, effort, or anything else. There's a final thought, I think, in Epictetus, which is, what would Socrates do? If unsure how to act in a situation, says Epictetus, ask yourself how Socrates would behave. Model yourself after the wisest. Look to Socrates. He continually improved himself in every way with reason as his guide. Of course, you and I may not have every excellence to the degree of Socrates, but we can live as individuals striving to become like Socrates. Finally, let's go to Marcus Aurelius. He was a Roman emperor. If you ever see the movie Gladiator, he is depicted in there wearing his purple toga as emperor and fighting the German barbarians off in the forest. When he died, I think it was about the year 181, that ended the Pax Romana, and then the Roman Empire spent about 300 years falling. So not only does Marcus Aurelius mark the high point of classical antiquity in terms of culture, literature, and philosophy. He also marks the political high point. So that's why I call Marcus Aurelius the climax. He's the high point. After this, everything starts falling off. And in a way, Marcus's Meditations epitomizes the whole moral outlook of classical antiquity. He wrote this book, the Meditations, as a bunch of notes where he was trying to summarize for himself all the best parts of all the literature and philosophy that came before in a kind of notebook form, in a summary or cliff notes or a crib sheet that he could carry around when he was in his tent or riding his horse between battles on the frontier to cheer himself up and keep his mind on the right path. So therefore, this book distills a lot of what's come before. So some of it should feel like review to you, but it's a great way of summing up. Marcus says, if I know somebody's ruling principles and motivations, nothing he does will surprise me. After all, does it shock me when a fig tree produces figs or an olive tree produces olives? All things find fulfillment in actualizing their nature. I point this out to you because, again, we will see this coming up repeatedly in Jesus. And it's actually come up, I believe, before. I think it came up in Seneca. This idea that you can reproduce virtue naturally like a tree produces fruit. So Jesus says the same idea in terms of by their fruits you shall know them. So you can judge what a thing is by the kind of fruit it produces. Another way, some people might say actions speak louder than words. Then there's this great passage where he talks about what you do when it's hard to get out of bed in the morning. And I'll just read it to you. It says, when it's hard to get out of bed in the morning, I remind myself, I rise to resume my life's work. I have another opportunity to do what nature made me to do. Nature did not make me to lie in bed under a warm blanket, but for action and exertion. Ants, bees, and birds work to bring order to their corners of the universe. Should I refuse to do the work of a human creature? So that is one that sticks with me a lot, because if you view yourself as having a function and to get up and do work just like ants and bees and birds, then you don't feel so bad about making yourself get out of bed, because you say, if I don't do that, am I inferior to an ant or a bee or a bird? I don't want to be inferior to an ant. I want to get up and do my work. So I find that particularly inspiring. Then he goes on again on this theme of not caring about what other people say. Suppose someone has spoken poorly of me. Does that hurt me? It's only a report about some words. I don't let my imagination concoct a drama based on it. Well, what a great thought, because I know for myself, and probably for you guys too, a lot of times I'm thinking about something and I'm concocting a drama in my head based on it. Like if it's not going well or I have a setback, it's very easy to concoct a drama in my own head in which I'm one of the players and someone else is a player in this drama and everyone's playing a part and I'm getting really upset. But the truth is that's all in my head, right? And we all do this. We all concoct these dramas and we make everything built up with our imagination into much more than it is. So we should always try to keep things on the level, as they say, grounded in reality. And then he makes this really interesting point below that, paragraph below that, and Socrates had this view too, that the person who does wrong is worse off than the person he does it to. When others try to hurt me, they hurt themselves. When they cheat or steal from me, they impoverish their own characters. Did someone do me wrong? That's his problem. He harmed his own character, not mine. They see virtue as its own reward, excellence as its own reward. Well, not being excellent, viciousness is its own punishment. And we can recall where Aristotle said the bad man can't love himself. He can't even sleep at night. He can't enjoy anything because he hates himself because he knows he's bad. So if you do wrong things to others, you end up hating yourself. And then that's not a good way to go through life. It's the opposite of happiness. Let's talk about one really interesting idea. My soul shapes the world does not shape my soul. Remember Aristotle saying that the principle of motion is within us. We are the source of our own actions. The idea of personal responsibility being one of the 10 core tenets of Western civilization. We cause our own actions. The principle of movement is within us, as Aristotle would say. And Marcus Aurelius expresses this same thought by saying, my soul shapes the world does not shape my soul. That's what we would today call a very conservative point of view. Some would call it a sort of reactionary point of view or a right-wing point of view. As I've tried to say, that what we call the left or the progressives believe just the opposite. Your soul does not shape the world, rather the world shapes your soul. So your environment shapes you. So if you grew up in a certain neighborhood and then you commit a crime, you commit the crime because of the neighborhood you grew up in. Or you didn't have the right parents, you didn't go to the right school, or something about your environment shaped you so that you're not responsible. And conservative people reject that, and they say it doesn't matter because from the same environment, two different people could come. One is a criminal and one's not a criminal. So how can the environment determine you? So this idea that my soul shapes the world does not shape my soul, has extremely political implications. And basically all the arguments between Republicans and Democrats today boil down to a disagreement on this philosophical point of view. As my father told me over the dinner table when I was about your age, maybe a little younger, and I said, well, Dad, what's a conservative and what's a liberal? Because I heard my parents arguing about this. And my dad said, well, it's really simple. Liberals make excuses for people and conservatives hold them accountable. And within certain limits, I think that's true. And I think it goes back to this idea of whether you think your soul shapes the world or the world shapes your soul. Now, what Marcus says is that my body can't move and do anything it wants. My mind has to pull the strings. My mind controls and my thoughts control what I do. And if someone does something bad, it's not because of their environment, it's because what they think about their environment, it's because of their thoughts. And he says something very interesting in here. My character means simply the sum of my thoughts over time. So if you put that together with the idea that character is destiny, as Heraclitus says, then basically your destiny is simply the sum of all your thoughts over time. So again, if my character is the sum of my thoughts over time, and my character is my destiny, then the sum of my thoughts over time is my destiny. That's my fate. And there's this idea also that we can only live in the moment. And I don't know if you were able to highlight any of that. But let's go to that passage. All the time I have amounts to a moment. At every moment I focus. Extremely important idea, focus in the moment. When we get to Ayn Rand in the second semester, she thinks that that's your fundamental moral choice. You have to focus or evade. And then within that, what you focus on is your basic choice. Going on, I notice my breath, sending out air and then drawing it back in. I live every moment like my last. How do I use my reason right now? That's the key question. All else seems smoke and ashes. Again, that question of focus. How do I use my reason right now? I embrace this day today as the first day of the rest of my life. I enjoy the present moment. I live only in the present moment, a single indivisible point in time. The past is already gone and the future I cannot know. This moment gives me all the life I'll ever have. No matter how many years stretch behind or in front of us, the present moment remains the same. Eternity revolves like a wheel, with its circumference touching a still point, the present moment. So when we get to Romantic poetry, the second semester, Wordsworth had this idea of the spot of time. And the point of art, he thought, was to capture these little spots of time in which we all live. And I would say when he says, I live only in the present moment, he doesn't say, I only consider the present moment. He says, the present moment is all we really know. He doesn't blind himself to everything else, but he says that's what life is. It's just a moment and a moment and a moment and a moment. I guess the question is there a contradiction between planning for the future and living in the moment? Is it a tension, or are the two things just two sides of the same coin? And how can you manage to both plan for the future and live in the moment? And I think you can do both. And I think that would be a very interesting paper to write or research topic, because I think both are obviously true. So they have to fit together somehow. Truly, to live at all, humans have to plan for the future, really. Like where your next meal is coming from, you can't just expect nature to give you fruit or money to grow on trees or anything else we need to live and be excellent and be happy. But at the same time, if we spend all our time obsessing about the future, then we're obsessing about something that we'll never experience, because the future is always in the future, right? So All your life is just made up of moments and moments and moments and moments all together. So somehow you have to find a way to be in the moment while also considering the future, because the future is going to be a moment that you experience when it comes. So your 16th birthday is going to be a moment. So you might want to plan for the future if you think, oh, who am I going to invite to my party? If you don't invite anyone to your party because you don't plan for the future, then the moment of your 16th birthday might not be very fun because no one will know it's your birthday and you'll be alone. So to me, that suggests that you must find a way to both live in the moment and plan for the future. And if you remember before, we were talking about Solon, and we said, well, he tried to do the intersection of two things, whatever was good and whatever was possible. And if it was both good and possible, he would do it. So I think with regard to planning for the future, it's the same thing. If you can do it and still be reasonably happy in the present, why not plan for the future? But as he puts it on the next page, I live in the present by eternal principles, thus live the gods. So he lives in the present, but the idea of an eternal principle, I would say that kind of captures the planning for the future a little bit. So you're in the present, but you're not totally of the present only. You're beyond the present, where he talks about living like a god, living by eternal principles. Last point before we say goodbye to Marcus and to the whole classical Greco-Roman world. Let's talk about change, because change is hard for everybody. Whether, somebody dumps you or somebody dies or you have to move or change schools or change friends. Why should change make me anxious? What would ever happen without change? How does nature work except by changing things? It's the nature of the universe. All things must change, including me. I embrace this. Everything that happens results from change. The universe loves nothing more than to change things, rearranging their elements to create new things. Everything that exists now serves as the seeds of something to come. Everything in the universe arises for a season, then returns to its elements, recycled into new forms. How ridiculous to consider death evil or contrary to nature. The parts of the whole must change for the continued growth and good of the whole. This doesn't bring evil to the parts. What benefits the whole must benefit the parts. Without death and renewal to clear away the old and bring forth the new, life would stagnate and grind to a halt. I look at death through the eyes of reason. It's nothing more than a process of nature. It's not only necessary, but beneficial to nature's ongoing work. Why fear it? So this is the philosopher's view of death. This is life as a preparation for death, learning to accept death, to see all of life within the perspective of that you will someday lose your life, and therefore you should appreciate every moment. YOLO, you only live once. But this idea that we have to accept change, that, as Heraclitus said, everything is change, everything's in flux. You can't step into the same river twice. So you must accept that the universe is constantly changing things, and that if we're too rigid and we don't kind of adapt to change, reality will in a certain sense punish us. And so that's one of the most difficult parts of being human, is to accept the changes that nature will throw our way. But in order to be happy, it's something that we have to do. I hope that you found some of this inspiring and thought, well, maybe that's something will help me to live my life, because that is why we do philosophy. It's why people write and why we read philosophy. Finally, he says, Marcus Aurelius, I live with the gods. How? By happily following the divine spark within, my reason and understanding. I reverence my reason as the God's gift. I worship it as the best thing in the universe. May the spark of divinity within me, the light of reason, guide me all my days, as a Roman, as a ruler, and as a man. And with those words, really, the classical world of Greece and Rome come to an end. And then something else begins, which has a different spirit. And we will study that next week. Christian idealism, which changes the world and really becomes the predominant religion in the West. And through Christianity, a Jewish influence comes into the West, which did not exist in Greece and Rome very much at all. But I would have, if we had time, I would have put in at least 2 readings from the Jewish Bible. I would have put in the book of Job and the book of Solomon, which are very famous and very important, but I just didn't feel that we had the time. So with that, I will bid you guys good night. And we're now halfway done.